You were only 9 years old when they first weighed you, naked, trembling in the shadows of the harem's back corridor, your skin still stung from the ceremonial bath. 2 eunuchs stood on either side of you, one gripping a scroll of parchment, the other slowly circling with a long, curved brass stick to prod your limbs into position. It was not enough to be beautiful. You had to be flawless. The bruise on your thigh from last week's stumble had not yet faded, and you could see the eunuch's lips tighten as his eyes flicked over it. Somewhere behind the curtain, someone was scribbling. Measurements, weight, eye color, teeth, gait, proportions, silence. No one asked your name. In that moment, you did not know that you were being priced. Your mother had vanished 2 winters ago in the raids. Your father, a Greek fisherman turned captive, had been lost in the empire's labor roads, building mosques until his back gave out. All that remained of your village was a crescent-shaped scar under your eye, the only thing the eunuchs could not polish or train away. You had been purchased by a Turkish official from the Kefe slave market on the Black Sea, a boy with a sharp tongue and clear skin. Now, you were no longer a child, you were a diplomatic commodity. Somewhere in the Russian court, a prince had written a letter, not one of state affairs or grain tariffs or military intelligence. No, this was a private correspondence, whispered over chessboards and velvet seats. The letter included a request, no, a favor for a boy, a special boy, well-groomed, educated in the Ottoman tongue, of mild temper, handsome, but not too proud, someone who would not draw too much attention, preferably Christian-born, but not devout. The empire complied, and you were packaged, wrapped in silks too fine for your age, instructed in Russian etiquette for 6 nights straight, forbidden to speak unless spoken to. The convoy that transported you across the Danube was not a slave train, no, not in name. It was a diplomatic courier, carrying letters and velvet-lined chests, accompanied by finely dressed men who called themselves scribes and translators. You were the smallest among them, seated in the rear cart, guarded by silence. When the Russian border guards lifted the tarpaulin, they looked past you. You were not seen. You were delivered. At the court of the Tsar, no one used the word gift. You were introduced as an assistant to the Ottoman delegation, a phrase that hovered politely above the truth. But you were not there to translate, nor to write, nor to negotiate. You were handed over first to a steward, then to a chamberlain, and finally, to the noble whose name you were made to memorize. He was a count, an advisor to the foreign ministry. He smelled of ambergris and vodka. His hands were dry. The first night, he only looked. The second night, he fed you pomegranate seeds with a silver spoon. By the third night, the doors to your room were locked from the outside. You were not the first. Your bedchamber had been used before. The portraits on the wall had not been chosen for you. The maidservant who brought you bread each morning never met your eyes. Somewhere in the archives of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, there was likely a file, a thin, forgettable file, listing the dates and destinations of diplomatic exchanges between St. Petersburg and Constantinople. In the margins, perhaps, a code, a single initial, a symbol, a discreet marking indicating the successful delivery of such gifts. Historians would later refer to them as tokens of peace, cultural envoys, living tributes. Children like you moved like coins across the borders of empires, clothed in silk and silence, swallowed into the void of aristocratic memory. But that night, in the frost-covered halls of a Russian estate, you did not know you were history. You only knew you were alone, and you were cold. To understand how a child could become a diplomatic gift between 2 great empires, one must step into the decaying yet still deadly machinery of 18th-century Eurasian geopolitics, a world where diplomacy did not merely involve treaties and trade, but also the exchange of bodies, bloodlines, and silence. The timeline is key. We are looking not at the early heights of the Ottoman Empire, nor the revolutionary flame of modern Russia, but at the long, dragging century between one empire's slow decline and another's cold ascent. The year is 1768. Europe watches with a cynical eye as the Russian Empire, led by Empress Catherine II, known to history as Catherine the Great, sharpens its claws on the southern border. The Ottoman Empire, once feared and impenetrable, is now bloated, fractured, and at war with its own inefficiencies. Between them lies a stretch of contested terrain, bloodied by centuries of crusades, counter-crusades, and forgotten treaties, and in the middle the fragile web of diplomacy. Both empires feared open war, yet both knew it would come. It is in these years between 1768 and 1774 that a unique form of back-channel diplomacy emerged. Unofficial emissaries exchanged through unofficial routes for unofficial purposes. Behind the embassies, beyond the official treaties, there existed a culture of coded understanding, It was not written in ink. It was whispered between translators, sealed behind velvet curtains, and confirmed with a nod across the table. A gift would be sent, a favor returned, a child. Perhaps, children, especially boys between the ages of 8 and 14, had long been commodities within the Ottoman palace system. The devshirme system, now waning by this time, had already normalized the seizure of Christian boys from the Balkans for centuries. These children were taken from their homes, forcibly converted to Islam, and raised as janissaries or court officials. But by the mid-18th century, the formal devshirme had ceased. In its place, a less official but no less insidious practice persisted. The training of palace boys, or icholans, young male servants raised within the imperial palace, not for military service, but for elite companionship, domestic duties, and, in many cases, sexual exploitation by high-ranking men of the court. The Ottomans did not write this down, nor did the Russians, yet both sides participated. Russian aristocracy, particularly in St. Petersburg and among the noble houses in Moscow, had begun to model aspects of Ottoman decadence, at least in private. Travel journals from Russian nobles visiting Constantinople frequently made mention of the harem, not just the female harem, which had been exoticized by European imagination for centuries, but also the quieter, more secretive male equivalents. There were whispers of exquisite boys, trained in music, poetry, and silence. The concept of the delicate page or courtly companion imported from Italy and Persia became a fashion of sorts, and as Russian diplomatic delegations increased contact with the Sublime Porte, some began to import more than just ideas. Enter the world of diplomatic gifting. In the Ottoman tradition, gifting was central to diplomacy. Carpets, silks, jewels, perfumes, trained birds, and even exotic animals were all exchanged between courts. But there is evidence, fragmentary, indirect, but chilling, that the Ottoman state, through unofficial channels, also offered living bodies as part of these gestures. Sometimes they were dancers, sometimes eunuchs, sometimes children. To the Ottoman mind, this was not slavery, at least, not in the brutal chattel sense seen in the Atlantic world. It was protocol, a deeply structured social hierarchy where every object, every person, had a role. The boy sent to a Russian nobleman was not viewed as a mere slave, but as a reflection of Ottoman court sophistication. Trained, polished, obedient. He was to impress, to charm, to embody the grandeur of the empire. His silence was as rehearsed as his posture. For the Russian aristocrat on the receiving end, the interpretation differed. These boys were treated as rarities, like a fine bottle of Persian rosewater or a priceless Bukhara tapestry. They were tokens of exoticism, luxury, and control. The child may have arrived with documents identifying him as an assistant or servant, but everyone understood the unspoken truth. He had been requested. He had been supplied. This system had no legal framework. That is what made it invisible. No czar would sign a decree to legitimize child gifting. No Ottoman vizier would admit to sanctioning it. Yet in the letters that survived, the private ones, coded in metaphors, we see glimpses. One Russian noble writes of the precious lamb sent in spring, bearing the scent of Turkish gardens. Another, more explicit, thanks a friend for the boy with almond eyes who sings in 2 tongues. These are not misunderstandings. They are transactions couched in poetry, executed in silence, and they were not rare. Archival fragments suggest that during the Russo-Turkish War of 1768 to 1774, as diplomatic pressure mounted, these gifts increased. When official embassies failed to reach agreements, informal emissaries filled the gaps. Ottoman envoys, seeking to sway key Russian nobles to favor peace or stall military movements, turned to personal persuasion. One boy for one promise, one voice of silence in exchange for one vote of delay. Such arrangements were not documented in war treaties, but they lingered in the margins. The children were not counted among casualties or spoils. They were simply removed, displaced, absorbed. Later, when Russian nobles died and their estates were inventoried, some of these boys, now teenagers or young men, were listed not as persons, but as property. One Turkish boy, age 17, one servant of unknown origin, mute, approximately 16 years, no names, no rights, no grave markers. They had been exchanged like heirlooms. Thus, behind every grand hall, where Ottoman rugs adorned the floors and Russian chandeliers glittered above, behind every toast to peace and every bow of civility, there lingered the invisible presence of children, boys who had been scrubbed of their pasts and presented as gestures of goodwill. They were the darkest kind of diplomacy, the kind no empire ever confesses. Imagine, if you will, the beginning of a ritual, not one cast in sacred incense or public proclamation, but in the quiet, practiced mechanics of a bureaucracy that did not need laws to function. A child, usually between the ages of 8 and 12, is selected, not kidnapped, not purchased in chains, not taken screaming from a battlefield. No. The method is far more civilized, more insidious. The selection occurs within the imperial confines of the Ottoman court, or in satellite cities like Edirne or Aleppo, or more commonly still, from the vast network of human brokers who operate in the grey waters of the Black Sea. These brokers were not slavers in the vulgar sense. They were handlers, men employed by Ottoman officials to source appropriate candidates for court service. They specialized in orphans, war captives, or the children of desperate Christian families from Bulgaria, Armenia, the Caucasus, and Crimea. To these families, the offer was often framed as salvation. Your son will live in a palace. He will wear silk. He will be educated. He will serve princes, and perhaps it was better than starvation. The child would be transported, not in iron, but in wagons lined with straw. He would be renamed, often with a soft, poetic name. His Christian origins would be quietly erased, baptismal scars smoothed over with oils, crosses hidden. His training began immediately. The Ottoman court was not unpracticed in this. The Topkapi Palace in Constantinople had entire quarters, both known and secret, where children were shaped. There, boys were not merely taught language or etiquette, they were taught presence. A Turkish boy must glide, not walk. His hands must rest in stillness when not gesturing. His voice must remain low, modulated, with a practiced, mournful melody. A single wrong posture, an errant glance, these were corrected swiftly, often with pain, but above all, the boy was taught silence. There would be no crying, no questioning, no asking to go home. He was bathed daily in rosewater and goat's milk, fed on dates, almonds, and honeyed flatbread to maintain skin glow. Sometimes his eyelashes were darkened with kohl. His hair, grown long, would be styled in loose Ottoman curls, unless the recipient preferred a Christian appearance, in which case, it was trimmed and brushed back like a little European courtier. Everything depended on the taste of the one who would receive him. There was, somewhere in the palace, a logbook, not a public ledger, but a guarded register. Here, boys were listed under simple categories: age, height, language ability, temperament, beauty. Those deemed most promising were kept in waiting, a kind of living inventory, stored for use when the empire needed to exert pressure or offer appeasement to a foreign power. And when the moment came, a name, or rather, a description would be selected, and the preparations would begin. The child would be cleaned more rigorously now, dressed in neutral robes, fed lightly to avoid bloating. An escort would be assembled, typically a caravan of minor officials, scribes, and one high-ranking eunuch. Officially, they were carrying documents, letters, small gifts, nothing unusual. And inside one of the carriages, the child, he would be told he was going to serve, to represent the court, to be loyal. The journey across the Balkans or through the Danubian corridor could take weeks. In winter, the boy would sit bundled in furs, too frightened to speak. In summer, sweat would stain his robes and drip into his eyes. The guards rarely spoke to him, except to bark instructions: sleep, silence, sit. Arrival in Russia was not grand. The delegation would stop first at an estate, often far from the capital, a border villa or a dacha owned by a nobleman. There, the boy would be unwrapped like a parcel, his appearance inspected, his manner tested. If something displeased the recipient, a crooked tooth, a weak voice, a limp, the boy might be returned. But most were not. Most were accepted. What followed was not formal ownership. Russia, unlike the Ottoman Empire, did not have a sanctioned harem structure. But among the nobility, there existed what some historians call the private circle households, with a separate wing or chamber for servants of foreign origin. These spaces were quiet, insulated from domestic gossip, and kept off the official staff registries. The boy would be given a room, not a cell, but not a child's room either. Spartan, clean, decorated with things he could not touch. He would be instructed in Russian, taught the preferences of the nobleman, how to pour his wine, how to clean his boots, how to recite Pushkin. In some cases, the boy was trained to play music, a silent harp, a lute, anything soft. Over time, the nobleman would begin to visit. At first, only during meals, then during evening readings. Eventually, in the night, the domestic staff understood. They had seen others. No one spoke. Some maids left notes with bits of food. Others averted their gaze entirely. If the boy wept, He did so into his pillow, under the furs, in the silence that had been beaten into him back in Constantinople. Years passed this way. Some of these boys were kept for only a season. Others remained for years, aging into soft young men, until their presence became inconvenient. When that happened, there were options: send them to a distant estate, marry them off to a serf girl, enlist them quietly in a frontier regiment, or simply let them vanish into the snows outside Moscow. A few, a very rare few, ascended. There are whispers of one boy who became a steward, another who managed the household accounts for a prince in Tver. But these are outliers. Most left no record at all. No gravestone, no surname, just a ghost trail, an Ottoman rug in a back hallway, a silver brush with a name carved in Turkish, a line in a will to be given to the silent one. They were not slaves, not quite, not adopted sons either. They were shadows, and like all shadows, they left only silence in their wake. If this story were only about one boy, or even a dozen, it might be dismissed as anecdotal tragedy, the kind history conveniently forgets. But the truth is far colder. This was not an accident. This was not deviation. This was system. There is a temptation in modern thinking to separate personal vice from political structure, to believe that perversion lives only in the dark corners of powerful men's lives, while the state operates with clean hands and clear intent. But in empires, especially empires as ancient and convoluted as the Ottoman and Russian, the private desires of powerful men often become state machinery, or worse, become invisible within it. To understand how these exchanges of boys became institutional, one must look not at the children, but at the quiet architecture of the state. Let us begin with the Ottoman Empire. By the mid-18th century, the Ottoman state had perfected a system of grooming young boys into service long before any gift was ever considered. While the devshirme, the official levy of Christian boys for janissary service, had officially faded by the late 17th century, its shadow persisted. The infrastructure remained: the training houses, the handlers, the scribes, the palace eunuchs. The machinery no longer fed the military, but instead pivoted to the court. These boys, no longer soldiers, became part of what was known as the enderun, the inner service of the palace. While the enderun was officially presented as an elite educational path, offering upward mobility to promising boys, it also became a convenient holding ground for those considered valuable, beautiful, obedient, forenzopters, Some were trained for courtly service, others for diplomacy, and still others, though never publicly acknowledged, for pleasure. There was no written policy stating that boys could be gifted to foreign powers. The Ottomans did not need one. Their culture operated on unspoken hierarchies, tradition, and protocol. The practice of gifting was a sacred part of Islamic and Turkic court culture going back centuries. When a sultan wished to impress or bind another ruler, he sent what the Ottomans called peshkesh offerings. These were not bribes, but signs of good faith: carpets, horses, falcons, and yes, sometimes people. The gifting of people was not new. Female concubines had been given to Egyptian governors and Persian shahs. Eunuchs were often presented to Arab courts. In some cases, these gifts were a way to remove politically risky individuals from court: a beautiful slave who might draw too much attention, or a servant who knew too much. But when it came to young boys, the reasoning was more delicate. They were not disposable. They were symbolic. A gifted boy was meant to embody Ottoman refinement. He had been shaped by the palace, molded, perfumed, and trained. He was an extension of the empire's grace. To refuse such a gift would be an insult. To accept it was to enter into a private bond. It was diplomacy, not of ink and parchment, but of flesh and eye contact. But what of Russia? The Russian Empire, for all its outward piety and orthodox rigidity, was far from innocent. The aristocracy, especially under the reign of Catherine the Great, developed a taste for foreign luxuries: French governesses, Italian music tutors, Persian carpets, and Ottoman boys. Though Russia had no formal system of grooming such servants, it had a highly developed system of silencing them. The Russian noble class operated within a world of serfdom so absolute that human life was counted in rubles. A nobleman could buy, sell, exile, or execute a serf with little to no consequence. And while serfs were typically Russian peasants, the legal grey zone surrounding foreign servants allowed aristocrats extraordinary freedom. Foreign boys, especially those arriving under diplomatic missions, were not serfs, but neither were they citizens. They were ghosts in the system, unnamed in official household logs, excluded from the church rolls, and protected by the veil of noble privacy. No one asked how they came. No one recorded when they left. The few records we do have come from estate inventories, travelogues, and personal correspondence. A letter from a countess in Smolensk mentions her husband receiving a Turkish boy of striking manners, who now plays flute in the East Parlour. A diary entry from a tutor in Tula describes his master's silent lad from the Bosphorus, who tends to the hothouse orchids. Another from a valet in Moscow writes, "He does not speak, but he listens, always listening. The master says he came as a gift from the Turks. I believe it. But these are only the fragments. Behind them was an unspoken understanding. Ottoman boys were acceptable additions to a noble household. They were evidence of power. To own such a child was not just an indulgence, it was a sign, a message to one's peers that one had diplomatic reach, that one was favoured by foreign courts, that one could acquire what others could not. The state allowed it because it benefited from it. The Russian court, particularly during the long years of border tension with the Ottomans, found value in maintaining unofficial lines of favour. If a Turkish pasha sent a boy to a Russian nobleman, that nobleman was more likely to advocate for peace, to delay military action, or to provide softer intelligence, and the Ottoman state, in turn, knew that soft power often worked where hard power failed. This was not written into any treaty. It was never proclaimed from any pulpit, but it functioned. The boys, therefore, were not exchanged by accident or whim. They were placed with precision, with purpose, and the system supported them in silence. It trained them, transported them, and disappeared them when necessary. Even the church, both Islamic and Orthodox, remained largely quiet. For the Ottomans, the boys were often from Christian families, and thus outside the full protections of the Ummah. For the Russians, they were foreign and unbaptized, excluded from moral jurisdiction. Neither religion wanted the stain. This mutual denial created the perfect vacuum, and in that vacuum, a system flourished, unwritten, unrecorded, but real. A system that turned human children into instruments of diplomacy. A system that placed a boy in a room with a foreign man and called it peace. Empires rarely leave behind tidy records of their sins. The corridors of power echo with proclamations of glory, of conquest, of divine right. But the shadows the boys delivered in silence. The doors locked from the outside. The whispered exchanges in candlelit parlours, these vanish. Or they try to. Until, one day, the consequences come back. Quiet at first, then undeniable. The practice of gifting young boys across borders between Ottoman handlers and Russian nobles left few names, fewer graves, and no monuments. But the damage, like rot beneath polished marble, sank deep into the psyche of both societies, not just in the children, but in the empires themselves. Let us begin with the most intimate cost: the boys. Most of them disappeared from the record, as they were meant to, their birth names stripped, their languages erased, their bodies disciplined into tools of courtly service. But trauma has a way of echoing through the generations, even if unspoken. Some of these boys, those who survived adolescence, may have fathered children with Russian women, often serfs, in quiet corners of vast estates. Their blood, mixed with nobility, vanished into the peasant class, and with it, the confusion of origin, the inherited silence, the ache of being both foreign and forgotten. There is no documented rebellion, no uprising of the gifted boys. Their training, their isolation, their utter dependence on the households that received them all ensured compliance. But compliance is not healing. It is not justice. It is not peace. It is endurance. One Ottoman eunuch, in a rare surviving letter intercepted by Austrian agents during the late 18th century, wrote of sending 3 pearls to the snow court, each unripe but polished. His tone was not remorseful, it was proud. But in that word unripe lies the truth. These were not diplomatic couriers. They were children, and in Russia, the cost was no less corrosive. Among the nobility, the practice never became public scandal. It was hidden beneath layers of status and privacy. But in the salons of St. Petersburg, among the literate and observant, whispers grew. Novels appeared with veiled references. A few daring poets wrote of roses frozen in the glass halls of empire, metaphors that meant more to those who knew. Some noble families, generations later, quietly destroyed correspondence that hinted at such gifts. In others, these boys were memorialized in twisted ways, painted into portraits as unnamed attendants, forever staring blankly beside a gloved master. But the deepest consequence was cultural. By participating in this quiet trade of bodies, both the Ottoman and Russian elites normalized the dehumanization of the foreign and the young. This seeped into law enforcement, into education, into the way peasants were treated and the way children were viewed not as autonomous beings, but as potential property, as extensions of prestige. The practice blurred moral lines for those at the top. If one could accept a boy as a gift, one could justify anything, and this legacy endured long after the boys stopped arriving. In the Ottoman Empire, the fall of the devshirme and the eventual westernization efforts of the 19th century did little to erase the memory of palace servitude. Even as constitutional reforms reshaped the court, the inner circles retained the culture of silence, servants remained invisible. Children in the lower classes still feared being taken to the palace. It was a phrase passed down like folklore, not with grandeur, but with dread. In Russia, the collapse of the aristocracy following the 1917 revolution brought mass upheaval, but not necessarily clarity. Noble estates were sacked, their records burned, their owners killed or exiled. The boys, those who had once served them, were already gone, buried in unmarked graves or lost in wars. But trauma lingers in families, in silences, in habits passed without explanation. Historians interviewing Soviet-era peasants sometimes encountered odd tales of the quiet one who lived with the baron, or the foreign child who helped plant roses, or the lad who never married, never spoke, and died in winter. They are footnotes in memory, but they are real. On a societal level, the practice widened the gap between ruler and ruled. By turning living beings into gifts, objects to be traded, the ruling classes reinforced the notion that morality need not apply to power, and once that line is crossed, it becomes harder to draw again. The same logic that justified gifting a boy could justify silencing a village, or starving a region, or executing a poet. And so the empires crumbled not just from war or economic strain, but from moral erosion. Diplomacy, which should have been a bridge between cultures, became a market of veiled transactions. Trust, once bought with silks and treaties, began to be purchased with lives. And once that transaction becomes normalized, once the bodies of children are folded into the ledgers of power, then nothing is sacred. Even today, remnants of this rot can be found in the buried archives of Ottoman couriers, in the half-erased letters of Russian noblewomen, in the way some historians still avoid this subject altogether, too uncomfortable to name what was done, too worried to disturb the myth of elegance. But history does not exist to protect comfort. It exists to reveal, and what it reveals here is a quiet genocide of identity, a theft of boyhood, of language, of the right to be human, carried out not by monsters, but by diplomats, by noblemen, by empires that thought themselves enlightened. They erased names, but they left patterns, and those patterns speak. Long after the halls have crumbled, if you walk through the ruins of certain Russian estates today, you might find nothing. No plaques, no markers, no mention of the silent boys who once wandered those candlelit halls, their small feet muffled on Turkish carpets, their eyes fixed on the floor. Time has erased their names with brutal efficiency. The revolution burned the records, the wars claimed the witnesses, and the snow, that relentless Russian snow, has covered the rest. But absence is not the same as forgetting. The air remembers. The silence remembers. There is something deeply human about the need to hide shame behind polish, to lace brutality with elegance. A boy wrapped in silk does not look like a prisoner. A flute in his hand distracts from the lock on his door. The presence of Turkish perfume on his collar makes it all feel foreign, endeavory, distant, exotic, something outside ourselves. But it was never foreign. It was designed, it was executed, and worst of all, it was accepted. That, perhaps, is the most devastating truth of this forgotten trade between empires. How easily it was normalized. How quietly it was carried out. No whips, no cages, just smiles, nods, handwritten notes passed between lords. The child, the gift, the flesh, delivered not to be punished, but to be enjoyed. When a Russian noble accepted a boy from an Ottoman pasha, he was not breaking the law. He was performing a rite, reinforcing a bond, participating in a ritual older than himself, with roots that stretched back through Byzantium and Persia and Rome, where bodies were currency and desire was diplomacy. And the boy, he vanished. The last thing he might have seen was a chandelier, or a gloved hand, or a snowflake melting on a velvet curtain. He would not be remembered. He would not be buried under his own name. He would not be mentioned in history class. But you remember now, you, hearing this, feeling the weight of it, are already carrying a name that was never spoken aloud, because the legacy of these boys lives not in monuments, but in the way we continue to ignore them, in how we praise empires without questioning what they cost, in how we quote Catherine the Great and the Ottoman viziers without hearing the weeping behind their walls. It lives in the corners of our understanding, where we still think diplomacy is clean and history is noble. It is not. It is soaked in tears that were never counted. And so, what do we do now? We cannot unwrite what was done. We cannot find every name. We cannot trace each boy from palace to parlor to grave. But we can remember the shape of the silence. We can recognize the pattern. We can say aloud what they could not, that this happened, that it was not rare, that it was not love, not service, not tradition. It was erasure, and the lesson, now, is to guard against the same quiet erasures in our present, to listen for the footsteps that are not recorded, to question the rituals that wear the mask of civility, to ask, always who is missing from the page, because history is not just what we preserve, it is what we allow to disappear. And the gifts were made to disappear, but not today. Today, we speak them back into existence, one by one, in defiance of the silence, in honor of their stolen names,